Teacher's History of the United States is brought to you by $49sites.com. That's the number $49sites.com. Hello, welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us today. Did you know that Paul Revere's famous engraving of the Boston Massacre wasn't actually his? He copied it from another colonist.
Did you know that contrary to popular belief, Paul Revere wasn't the only Midnight Rider? It was actually the Midnight Riders. Plural.
And in the Battle of Lexington, the colonists did not block the path to Concord. In fact, they gathered away from the road on the Lexington Green, and the regulars went out of their way to confront them. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will cover that and more in episode 54, Extra Credit. The shots heard round the world. Hello and welcome into episode 54. It is an extra credit, shots heard around the world, and I'm really excited for this one. We are finally back to our narrative of the American Revolution, and I am pumped to get this moving forward. And today is an extra credit episode, as you know, and me, Chris Caldwell, is joined by none other than my two fellow history nerds, Bill Gorman and Zach Woods. What's up, guys?
How's it going, Chris?
Hey, Chris.
It is good to have you guys back. It feels very familiar. So today what we're going to do is we're going to dive, like I said, back into the narrative. And as you heard from the title of the episode, the shots heard around the world. Today we are going to be covering the battles of Lexington and Concord and the midnight ride of Paul Revere. But as you know, and as I mentioned last episode, it has been 4 episodes since our last narrative episode. We had the Unit 1 and 2 review, we had the Q&A, and then we had the 2 primer episodes, the What's What of the American Revolution and the Who's Who of the American Revolution. So just to sort of place you back in the narrative of American history and remind you what has been going on. Just prior to episode 49 and 50, when we left our current narrative, Britain had passed the Coercive Acts of 1774, and most notable in them was the Boston Port Act, which said that as of June 1st, 1774, the port of Boston would be shut down. They also passed the Murder Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Quartering Act. And as you know, the colonists did not respond very well to these at all, and they really began to turn against the crown at this point. In episode 48, we talked about Benjamin Franklin and the embarrassment that the verbal beating he took in Parliament and how that caused him to turn once and for all towards the colonial cause. He was embarrassed by the fact that he leaked the letters of Thomas Hutchinson and had to admit to it. And then before he went in front of Parliament, a lot of stuff hit the fan back in the colony, and he basically got the blame for it. And then the last episode before we went a bit off track was episode 49, and that was the establishment of the first Continental Congress in the colonies. And what the Continental Congress basically decided was that in 1774, when they left, October of 1774, they decided that they were going to gather again the following May in 1775 to discuss how Parliament responded to their demands. They basically said that they wanted to enter into a non-importation with Britain. They wanted to address the people of Great Britain, and they prepared a official address to the king about their issues. And that brings us to episode 54, the shots heard round the world and the battles of Lexington and Concord. Last episode, Bill and I did the who's who of the American Revolution, and we purposefully left out one of the most famous revolutionaries, Mr. Paul Revere. And that's because we were going to cover him more in detail in this episode today. So I will begin with the background to Paul Revere and a bit of the spy network in Boston at this time. Is that good with you guys?
Let's roll.
All right, sounds good. So Paul Revere, born in the north end of Boston in 1734, he was the third of 12 children, and as most people know about Paul Revere, he was an incredibly good silversmith. Did you know for a while he was also a dentist?
I had no idea, actually.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. Don't you use silver for filling teeth?
You can. Yeah, you can. I guess in the 18th century that was more common, yes. But he became a dentist when the economy got bad after the French-Indian War. He actually took up dentistry, which I did not know about. During that aforementioned French and Indian War, he enlisted in the provincial army, and after the war is when he officially moved back to Boston and took over the family silver shop. Now, he became good friends with one Dr. Joseph Warren. They had common political views, and they were both Masons, and Dr. Warren is someone that we will talk about in more detail. He's a very famous revolutionary from Boston during the mid-1770s. He dies at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and we'll give a bit of background on Dr. Warren during our episode on Bunker Hill. Both Dr. Warren and Paul Revere were members of the Sons of Liberty in Boston and the North End Caucus, which was a political group on the north side of Boston. And something that I mentioned in our Did You Know at the beginning of the episode, the famous engraving of the Boston Massacre, which I did not realize until doing research for this episode, which is a bit embarrassing because I've brought it up multiple times. It was not actually Paul Revere. A colonist named Henry Pelham was actually the one that drew the bloody massacre. And what happened is he lent it to Paul Revere for one reason or another, and without Pelham's permission, Revere copied it, took credit for it, right? He engraved it, he printed it, and did not give Pelham any credit, and he put it on sale a week before Pelham, which is why Revere gets all the credit for it. But it ends up being okay because Pelham was a dirty Tory. So who really cares, right? Forget him. Paul Revere was also one of the ringleaders of the Boston Tea Party, and he was, as the time gets closer to the war, he was a courier for the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety was basically a group that sent around information from Boston to the cities of New York and Philadelphia, spreading the news that was going on in Boston so they could rally support from these two other major port cities in the New England and Middle colonies region. Revere, it said he wrote about 18 different times to New York and Philadelphia. So he was a very well-known courier of revolutionary propaganda during this time. After General Gage shut down the port of Boston in 1774 in the Coercive Acts through the Boston Port Act, which I mentioned a few moments ago, Revere and a couple dozen merchants began to meet at their favorite tavern, the Green Dragon, to coordinate spy efforts in Boston and specifically to report different troop movements into the countryside. On April 7th, Revere heard rumors of troop movements and headed to Concord to warn the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly. Now, at this point, residents of Concord, so we're like a little over a week and a half before the actual battles of Lexington and Concord, began to move supplies away from the town. And on April 14th, 1775, Gage received orders from Lord Dartmouth to disarm the rebels, repossess the arms, and arrest John Hancock and Sam Adams. And Gage ordered this to happen, quote, with utmost expedition and secrecy to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all military stores, but you will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property. So that sets us up for the events of the night of April 18th and the day of April 19th, leading us to the battles of Lexington and Concord. And Bill, I know I stole some of your thunder because you wanted to talk a bit more about Paul Revere, and I just did. So I'm sorry about that, but did you want to jump in and talk about
That's all right, Chris. You do that constantly, so let's just start talking about the night of April 18th, 1775. It's okay. I forgive you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Multiple journal entries that day indicated that it was a rainy day, the 18th, which I'm sure made it a lovely conditions for a horse ride that day. Luckily, though, for our riders, yes, riders plural, the rain cleared by the evening of April 18th. The night was so clear, you could say, that you could probably see the illumination of a lantern or two from some distance away. So, Zach and Chris, please finish this line off for me. Listen, my children, and you shall hear. Now, you guys.
The story of Paul Revere.
Close enough. Of the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
Zach, you failed. Zach, you're kicked off.
It was close.
I don't
You
know.
got the rhyme.
Get the hell out of here.
I need a repeat.
Nope, no takesies backsies.
So I 100% believe the reason why we have simply forgotten the other Midnight Riders is because of that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem. 100% believe that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That said, the contributions of William Dawes and Samuel Prescott will no longer go unnoticed thanks to this podcast.
Yeah, thanks to a teacher's history of the United States. Dawes and especially Prescott will receive their
So,
due.
as regular listeners of the podcast will recall, and as Chris just laid out there, Paul Revere is the famous one, right? Boston silversmith. He's the true believer in the cause of independence. From the British perspective, this dude's an insurgent. He would be an insurgent today, right?
Yeah,
a traitor.
Yeah, I see what you're trying to do.
Well, actually, I have a line here
okay.
from a debate in Parliament regarding our rebellious forefathers, the Patriots.
How dare you.
Given that there was a debate as to whether militiamen and Minutemen should be considered enemy belligerents with the rights and status of a nation, or merely traitors and rebels who should not be dignified with the conventions of war and prisoner exchange.
Thank you, Zach.
I like that. No, that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Moving on from Paul Revere, I think you've covered that semi-eloquently, Chris. William Dawes was one of the forgotten Midnight Riders. Now, Dawes was a Boston tanner or leather maker. Dawes was another true believer. He protested imported British goods actively. He joined a Patriot militia. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty. Dawes was so committed to the cause that he even stole British cannon following a break-in at the Boston Commons. This dude was willing to risk blood and treasure for the cause. Now, Samuel Prescott is our third. He's our other forgotten Midnight Rider. Prescott's a pretty young man, 24-year-old doctor from Middlesex County, when he participated in his part of the Midnight Ride. Prescott didn't start from Boston like Revere and Dawes.
Started in Lexington, right?
Just outside of Lexington. Not nearly as much is known about Prescott as obviously Revere and Dawes, but it is believed that Prescott was also a member of the Sons of Liberty, but he did not have nearly the clear record of insurrection as Revere and Dawes had at that point in time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, and I might be mistaken, but I feel like I remember way back in the day reading something about Prescott being in Lexington to visit his girlfriend.
He was on a date that night. He was courting a young woman. Dr. McDreamy. That's right. He was. Yeah. I think in one of the letters of correspondence, he was referred to as the most eligible bachelor in Middlesex County. So this is the kind of fellow we're talking about here. But so to continue,
I'm that much more excited for this episode now.
A little piece of trivia. Hopefully that pops up on Jeopardy one day. So now that
Can you imagine that? The most eligible bachelor in Middlesex County in 1775.
Who is Samuel Prescott?
Samuel Prescott.
Now that we've talked about the who involved on the evening of April 18th, 1775, let's move in and talk about the what and why of the Midnight Ride. Now, Chris mentioned Dr. Joseph Warren. It was Warren who dispatched Paul Revere and William Dawes to ride to Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock that the British General Thomas Gage was marching his army to capture those two. Their ride was then to continue to Concord to warn the militias as the British were intent on destroying or seizing the munitions held in the city, or so they thought were held in that city. At approximately 9:30 p.m. that evening, Dawes leaves Boston for Lexington. Now, Dawes went south. If you've ever been to Boston, you know that the city is kind of a horseshoe-looking thing, right? Like it kind of U's. So Dawes went south across Boston to Roxbury, then west and north through Brookline, which we actually stayed in when we were in Boston. Lovely part of town.
Something to remember for folks who look at a modern map is that Boston at the time had a lot of the land hadn't been reclaimed yet. So it really was this this peninsula with a very narrow neck that connected to Massachusetts proper.
Yeah, Zach is our resident Boston expert. He lived there for a short period of time.
I've been to Brookline and downtown Boston. It was okay.
Yep, it is a great city, and actually, the three of us all did the
Freedom Trail.
Freedom Trail. Yeah, that was great. That was a lot of fun. It was about this time last year, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were a little ahead of ourselves, I think.
Just a bit.
Just a bit. All right. Anyway, I digress. Bill, back to you.
He then went west and north through Brookline, Brighton, and Cambridge before hitting Lexington. All told, Dawes went 17 miles in 3 hours. Not so bad, I guess. Not at all. Bad. Somehow, some way, Dawes made it through the British checkpoint. Zach mentioned the Boston Neck. That's where he had to get out of. And the British Army obviously was ready to move with Gage. Things were on high alert. Checkpoints were in place. Sentry posts were in place. Patrols were in place. Dawes had to get out of there, but somehow he did. But nevertheless, Dawes made it through and arrived in Lexington at approximately 12:30 a.m. Let's jump back to Mr. Revere. Revere departed Boston at approximately 10 p.m. He crossed the Charles River by boat, then wrote from Charlestown to Lexington. Of course, the Charles River is of import here because of the route the British regulars would take. I'm sure you've heard this before, Chris and Zach. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea.
I have heard that.
Was the order for the amount of lanterns to post in the Old North Church, which is also featured in the Nicolas Cage film National Treasure. So in the Old North Church,
you can't help yourself.
I cannot.
Man.
It's a fantastic film.
It's
a fantastic film. I was just at the National Archives and I wanted to steal the Declaration of Independence.
You're such an awful actor.
So if the British regulars were to move out, the two lanterns in this case were supposed to warn the inhabitants and the militias of Charlestown that the British regulars were moving out by sea. That is to say, across the Charles River. Now, Revere, I digress a little bit there, but Revere, after a brief run-in with a British patrol, arrived in Lexington at approximately 12 midnight. Together with Dawes, they successfully warned Hancock and Adams that they needed to skip town.
And Revere had crossed through the Charles River, correct? Revere went by sea?
Yeah,
so
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
I think you could say by all accounts that first stage of the ride was quite a success. Revere was able to warn the local militias that the British regulars were on the move. Dawes and Revere were able to get Hancock and Adams out of Lexington. Their attention then turned to Concord. Unfortunately, the second stage of the ride, the one to Concord, does not go as smoothly. Shortly after departing for Concord, Dawes and Revere come across Samuel Prescott, fresh off his date. Prescott decides to join their mission, which turns out to be a very, very good thing. According to Revere's account, at about the halfway point between Lexington and Concord, the riders were trapped by a British patrol. There was some organized chaos, a chase scene, and a daring escape. The end result was this. A. Revere was held prisoner by the British. B. Dawes managed to escape the British by lying his teeth off, but did lose his horse. And C. Prescott was able to ride away safely. It was Samuel Prescott that ultimately made it to Concord at approximately 2 a.m., thus completing the initial mission ordered by Joseph Warren. Think about that, though. It was only Dawes and Revere that were initially dispatched. They didn't happen across this fine young chap. I mean, it is conceivable that they don't make it to Concord.
Yeah.
What is also interesting to note, of course, the legend of Revere's Ride is, of course, immortalized in Wordsworth's poem. But we all have certain images of that ride because of that. And part of that image is you see him or galloping through the town, and he's shouting, "The British are coming." Right, Chris? Zach,
Yes.
you'd agree with that. So, but that doesn't,
Of course.
I got to tell you, for something that is supposed to be a kind of a covert action, right? Like, Chris, you spent some time talking about how they were essentially a spy network, an intelligence network. Does it really lend itself to covert action to start yelling through the town where there could be, and likely are, loyalists just out and about? I don't think so. Even in the hotbed of independence, Massachusetts, that is, Boston, there would still be townspeople loyal to the crown. If Revere communicated anything to the townspeople as he galloped through these hamlets, it would have been, "The regulars are coming out," not "The British are coming."
I would agree with that. I think that makes a lot more sense. Very good, Bill. Now you were able to get credit for that. You feel good?
I do.
Okay, great.
And with the ride over, with that, we're going to go ahead and take a break.
A Teacher's History of the United States, as you know by now, is brought to you by $49sites.com. If you go to the numbers, $49sites.com, you can see that they are a professional web design and content creation company with seamless and speedy site creation process. They will create for you a custom, cost-efficient, and responsive website for just $49 a month. It includes professional copywriting, engaging web content, search engine optimization, daily backups, hosting, no startup cost, unlimited updates, and if you use the keyword history in checkout, you get to upgrade to the Pro package for no additional cost, which also comes with the SSL certificate, Google Analytics, photo gallery, promotional pop-ups, text animation, and Google Map integration. We use $49sites.com for our website, and I am so much happier because I do not have to do all of the back-end work for the website, and it is totally worth it. In addition to $49sites.com, Bill, I know you are jacked about this. What launched?
Why the Patreon page, of course.
The Patreon page. Very good. It is www.patreon.com/teachershistory. If you like to support the podcast and the work we're doing here, we would really appreciate it. And if you go to patreon.com/teachershistory, you can see different ways that you can support us. This episode is actually being recorded on Zoom. Video recording, and we are going to post it for everyone to see about 5 or 6 days after this episode is released. And
they're gonna be disappointed on how we look.
Yeah, probably.
Sorry.
Well, at least you two. I think I look pretty good, but you two for sure. But no, we're going to be releasing this, and so if you want to go to the Patreon page, Actually, I'll release it right after this episode's out. So go to the Patreon page right after this episode's released, and you can see what the live video recordings are like, and that is one of the benefits of being a patron. Each level of patronage has certain benefits, and this will be one of them. All right, let's get back to the narrative. So, welcome back to the battles of Lexington and Concord and the shots heard around the world. So, let's start talking about those shots and the battles themselves. Bill gave a great introduction to the background of the men that rode that night and the narrative of the ride, and now we're going to shift our focus to the battles. So, the Battle of Lexington. Let's provide some context here. Francis Smith was the commander of the British expedition, and the purpose of the expedition was to figure out where the ammunition and weapons were being stored in Concord. In addition to that, though, they were aware that both John Hancock and Samuel Adams were staying in Lexington. Now, at this point, pretty much all of the rebel leaders outside of Revere and Warren had left Boston. The Patriots were aware of upcoming plans to invade the countryside because they had allies in London who sent word of the forthcoming orders, and so they actually knew of this impending invasion, so to speak, before General Gage did. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were in Lexington, staying at the house of one of Hancock's relatives. Now, like I mentioned, many of the colonists knew that the British were eventually going to go after the cache of weapons in Concord, and in order to get to Concord, you have to go through the small town of Lexington. Rumors have it that Margaret Gage, the wife of General Gage, who, by the way, she was a colonist, she was born in the colonies, may have been the one leaking the intelligence to the colonists prior to the battles, but no one is really sure. As Bill mentioned, Dawes and Revere left the night of April 18, 1775, Dawes by land and Revere by sea. They arrived in Lexington to warn Hancock and Adams, and the four men agreed that the British were sending far too many forces. Their gathering was far too large to just be going out to arrest the two men. So the four of them figured that Concord was likely the target. And as Bill mentioned, Dawes and Revere and then Samuel Prescott left to warn the rest of the countryside and the inhabitants of Concord. The warning system was incredibly efficient, to the point that the colonists knew about the march of the regulars while they were still unloading the boats in Cambridge, just outside Boston. In all, about 700 troops were sent out on the expedition, and it was a 17-mile march to Concord, which began at 2 a.m., and these men will end up marching for about 18 hours straight with very limited ammunition, and so it is not going to turn out well for them. They entered Lexington around sunrise, about 4 to 5 hours later. And it's said that there were about 80 militiamen gathered in Lexington, although eyewitness reports estimate it closer to 100 to 150, even upwards of 200 men. Captain John Parker led the colonial militia. And of course, what is the name of these Massachusetts militiamen?
Minutemen?
Yes, very good. Thank you, Zach. Bill, I know that, huh?
I knew that. I knew that.
You just let Zach take it?
Yeah. Every once in a while, I just, let somebody else do it.
How nice of you. How nice of you. And as most of you probably know, these men had the nickname the Minutemen because they could be ready at a minute or moment's notice. Many of them had actually been up pretty much most of the night waiting for some action and even doubted that Revere's warnings were true. Now, as the regulars approached, there were very good reasons for John Parker to protect his men and not tell his men to fire any shots first. Number one, he was far outmatched numerically, at least 5-1, and it would be silly for him to lose men in a skirmish that wasn't really going to accomplish anything significant. Number two, most of the supplies in Concord had already been moved and hidden, and most colonists were aware of that. And number three, in the past, and this had happened a couple times in events that we didn't really dive into, but the British had done this. They had gone out into the countryside to try and repossess a cache of weapons and have found nothing, and then they just marched home. So for the most part, it was pretty benevolent and no violence had ever began.
At this time, it's important to remember that the colonists might have had muskets in their houses, but the nature of militia service was that for there to be a magazine that would be controlled by the local government, that's where powder, muskets, shot, basically bullets would be stored for communal use. So the stockpiling of powder, shot, and muskets is a big deal, and something where if you're thinking from Gage's perspective, the military governor of Massachusetts and of all British troops in the colonies, his perspective is seizing these weapons is very important because at the time in America, there is no gunpowder production at all.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Zach, and that definitely provides context around why all of the ammunition is gathered in one area and why it was so important for the British to seize it. Like I mentioned, John Parker likely did not believe his colonists really had any chance. And so he actually gathered them, and I brought this up in the Did You Know? He gathered them on the Lexington Common, which was like a small open area in downtown Lexington, which we have all been to, not on the road to Concord. He gathered them in the Common off of the road. So technically the regulars could have kept marching on the road to Concord because they knew that literally standing in the way of the army was just going to get them killed. But John Parker did tell his men, stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have war, let it begin here. Now, it is said that John Parker likely had tuberculosis and a very weak voice. So it's incredible the details some people go into in reporting events. So they're not sure if the colonists actually could hear these words, but that is what he said. Now, a British officer, maybe Pitcairn, but they're not sure, yelled to the colonists, lay down your arms, you damn rebels. Parker, at this point, likely, and this is where everything gets a little hazy with the details, but Parker likely told his men to disperse and to go home. But they did not put down their arms, so they were carrying their guns with them back to their homes. Now, this would clearly be a violation of the British officers' orders, but no one really knows what happened next. All they know is that in the confusion, a shot was fired, maybe two. No one knows who fired it. If you were to read accounts of this event, you could read a dozen different accounts, and if they're from the British perspective, they all say the colonists shot first. If it's from the colonial perspective, they all say the British shot first. So who knows what happened? But both sides claim the other fired first. And actually, some believe that the first shots may have come from someone who wasn't even lined up in the parade order for the battle, so to speak, or the skirmish, but instead maybe from behind a tavern or from a wooded area or behind a wall. In the end, 8 Lexington men were killed, 10 were wounded. So you have 18 casualties on the colonial side. Meanwhile, the British only had 1 wounded soldier who was shot in the thigh. At this point, the men then began their march toward Concord to repossess the weapons and supplies of the colonists, knowing that they likely just started events that they were not prepared to defend or justify. And that brings us to the following engagement, the Battle of Concord. And Zach, you're going to take the lead on this one, correct?
Yep.
Awesome. Great. So take it away, man.
So Lexington is really more of a skirmish. This could be almost something that's analogous to what happened with the Boston Massacre. Kind of patriots or rabble-rousers have confronted British troops. British troops have fired and dispersed a crowd. Who thinks much of it? The British troops continue to march to Concord to fulfill their mission, and they arrive. Meanwhile, because of Paul Revere and Prescott, the militia are beginning to gather at Concord themselves and to be organized. They've heard the shots fired. People don't really know what's going on. You can see the confusion and, you can imagine the confusion as people come from surrounding towns and hamlets to arrive with their weapons saying, what's going on? Where's the fighting? What are we going to go do? And a gentleman by the name of Colonel Barrett basically starts to gather and organize the militia as they arrive. Lieutenant Colonel Smith of the British, his forces arrive, and Barrett, rightly, because his men are outnumbered 2-1 at this point, withdraws outside of Concord. Smith now has to fulfill his orders of finding the cache of weapons, gunpowder, and shot and destroy it, and proceeds to search the town. This is where it kind of comes into conflict with Lieutenant General Gage's orders. He doesn't want to have property destroyed because he knows for every bit of property he destroys, he's going to anger the colonists. This is something that in modern convention we would think of as winning the hearts and minds, right? If soldiers come in and destroy your house, how likely are you going to be to support the soldiers who came in and destroyed your house? So the British troops are searching. They find some shot, some gunpowder. They find some cannons. They destroy the trunnions of the cannons. These are basically metal. The only way to think of them as metal cylinders that are attached to the cannon tube that allows them to sit in a carriage. So they break those. And in the process of doing this, a fire breaks out in one of the houses as they destroy some gun carriages. And that action is what actually spurs the militiamen who are outside of the town waiting on the hill to act. These are folks who are seeing, their fellow countrymen's houses being destroyed by, the foreign invaders, essentially, and they want to go and do something. Now, all the while they were waiting on the hill, more colonists and militiamen have arrived. So their numbers have grown. So they feel a little bit more empowered to confront this larger British force. And they proceed to move to a bridge on the north side of town called the North Bridge. Now, there's some British troops that are stationed there, and this is where the Battle of Concord occurs. And it's really somewhat similar to the skirmish of Lexington, which is you have the two forces facing each other. Who's going to shoot first? No one's really sure. And the British end up firing first. The colonialists respond, and several British are wounded, some mortally, and the British give way, and the colonists proceed forward. Now, this is where Lieutenant Colonel Smith has to rally his troops because he's 17 miles away from his base of operations. He only has limited support. They've been marching all night and morning, and the force around him has started to gather. So he can't just stay there, right? His men need, ammunition, food, and water, so he can't just stay overnight. So he begins to retreat. And this retreat is what we think of when we think of the great colonialist militia success. Is during his retreat, these militia begin to attack in a series of ambush and flanking maneuvers along the retreat. So I want people to kind of close their minds here and think about walking along a road. It isn't just that your soldiers walk along a road in tight formation. You have to have light infantry or skirmishers protecting them on the side so you won't basically be ambushed. And if you have forces on the sides, they're going to come into contact with basically the other colonialists and militia. So it's this constant light infantry battle. And this is something that favors the colonialists. This is ironic, though, because Gage is actually the British officer who created the light infantry during the French and Indian War. And this was in response to the success that the French and the Native Americans had in fighting British regulars. The British performed very poorly against the Minutemen and the militia, who are fighting in basically their turf, which is this light infantry skirmish, shoot and scoot, shoot and move style, where you basically reform, attack, constantly outflanking your opponent. All the while, Smith needs to keep his men moving, because if his men stop, he's in trouble, because then he can get surrounded and cut off and run out of ammunition or water and have to surrender. While this is all going on, Smith did have the good fortune to realize he was potentially in trouble after Lexington and had sent a message back to Gage asking for additional support. Gage had activated another brigade of 1,000 British regulars under the Earl of Percy, who were sent from Boston to rendezvous with him. This column actually basically saved Smith's bacon. They were able to reconsolidate and march back into Charlestown and Boston. Meanwhile, though, the battle continues, similar to how it had occurred throughout the day. And the end result is the British column is able to escape and not get surrounded and completely cut to pieces like what happened in the French and Indian War with Braddock's column, but they've been battered, bruised, and bloodied. This is actually going to be a tremendous blow to Gage's psyche as the British commander. He will actually end up leaving as the overall commander of British forces in the colonies. Later in 1775. This also is actually going to cause him to get cold feet. Chris had mentioned how his wife was an American. He had originally been someone who had argued for a stricter, more forceful response from Parliament to put the colonists in place. Though he had gotten cold feet later on and had actually urged Parliament to repeal the coercive acts. And then finally, after this battle, he's going to realize that the potential. Let me rephrase that. He's going to realize that there is a greater distaste for the British government and the crown than he anticipated, and he's going to request 20,000 troops. And I want to read a quote here from Deliberations in Parliament, because it's important to understand that this war policy coming from the crown is part of the official government, right? It's from Parliament. We often think in America of just King George, and yeah, this was his policy. He was very much pro putting the rebellion down with violent means, but it was executed through the means of Parliament and needed parliamentary approval. And this will become important that parliamentary approval will become important at the conclusion of the war. So here's some quotes. I'm going to be reading from The Men Who Lost America, which is about British leadership in the American Revolution and how they basically lost America. So, quote, "In the House of Commons, speaker after speaker told ludicrous stories of the military incapacity of Americans to the great entertainment of the House. It was claimed that Americans were, quote, were neither soldiers nor could be made so, being naturally of a pusillanimous disposition and utterly incapable of any sort of order or discipline," end quote. It was said that owing to their laziness, lack of cleanliness, and defects of character, they were, quote, incapable of going through the service of a campaign, and they would, quote, melt away with sickness before they could face an enemy. Colonel James Grant on February 2nd had told the House that Americans would, quote, never dare to face an English army. And this is a veteran from the French and Indian War. So the point of this is the impact of this battle will be a shock. Yes, the British are able to destroy some arms in Concord. Yes, their column is able to escape. It shows that the people of Massachusetts, that there's a deep well of support for the Patriots. It also ends up besieging Gage and the British Army in Boston, trapped on the peninsula, and it sets up the next actions in this story, which is how to basically lift the siege of Boston. It's worth noting that at this very moment, there are 3 generals that the Crown has sent to America to assist Gage. This is Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne. And these are going to be the 3 generals who are going to play a critical role in the story of the American Revolution.
Zach, thank you so much for that overview. I really appreciate that. A couple things I wanted to add real quick. So The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire is by Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy, and that is where Zach read the excerpts from. He is a professor of history at the University of Virginia, and by your recommendation, Zach, that's quite a good book.
I always enjoy reading books from different perspectives. So,
Yeah.
right, we're Americans, so we hear the American story from our perspective. Yes, I think it is a good book, and it's very interesting to read books from different perspectives. So, the American Revolution is often told from our perspective about how we defeated the British Empire. What makes this interesting is it's from it's trying to take the lens of what did the officers and the politicians who had a war policy against the colonists, how did they fail? Because they did fail.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a couple other things I wanted to add to the narrative of Concord and the march back. There were 2 different points. There's Miriam's Corner, which was a very narrow bridge in which the British could only go 3 wide, in which the colonists attacked them. And then like a mile later, or a bit over a mile later, there's called the Bloody Angle on the way back. And Bill, Zach, and I actually walked this path, not the whole path because we're not in that good shape, but we walked the path on the way back when we went out to Lexington and Concord. And at the Bloody Angle, the road rises and curves sharply to the left in a wood area, and then again, like 500 yards later, it goes sharply to the right. And this is where a lot of the initial casualties happened for the British, and it was really a bloodbath for many of the British soldiers on the way back. A British regular said, quote, "We began to run rather than retreat in order. We attempted to stop the men and form them too deep, but to no purpose. The confusion increased rather than lessened. The officers got to the front and presented their bayonets and told the men if they advanced they should die. Upon this, they began to form up under heavy fire." And later, Lord Percy, who is the one that, like Zach mentioned, basically rescued the British soldiers from this carnage. And fun fact, while Lord Percy was on his way to Lexington, he stopped and asked a seemingly oblivious colonist for directions to Lexington. And I kid you not, he took a map out and gave the British soldiers directions to Lexington. And when people found out just how dumb that guy was, they banished him from the country, put him on a ship and made him leave for assisting the enemy, which is a very patriotic move. Appreciate that. But Lord Percy said of the colonists, quote, "During the whole affair, the rebels attacked us in a very scattered, irregular manner. but with perseverance and resolution. Nor did they ever dare to form into any regular body. Indeed, they knew too well what was proper to do so. Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about, having been employed as rangers against the Indians and Canadians. And this country, being much covered with wood and hilly, is very advantageous for their method of fighting. I always found that quote to be just super important because most people believe that the militia were very disorganized and just a bunch of hunters who were going out there with their muskets to, kill some British regulars, but that wasn't the case. They were very organized. They knew exactly what they were doing the entire time. As Zach mentioned, after the British got back to Boston, they were surrounded, and that they were. The next morning when they woke up, there were about 15,000 militiamen surrounding Boston on three sides, led by Artemas Ward, and they were preparing for a larger conflict in the future.
So with the aftermath of Lexington and Concord, a couple things are going to change. First, the conflict there's going to be escalation. There's going to be more bloodshed. And with that escalation, the fiction of opposing Parliament and not the king is going to break down. It had already started to break down with the Continental Congress and whatnot, but remember, this is 1775. The Declaration of Independence isn't going to come until 1776. So this conflict, or this battle, there's going to be a severing of the rhetoric about talking about how it's Parliament that is abusing us and it's going to become the king that's abusing us, and that we must overthrow the king's rule. That's important.
Yeah, for sure. This is a major shift in the messaging back in the colonies, because up to this point it's basically been King George can do no wrong, and it's all Parliament who is standing in our way. And you're right, Zach, that does begin to change.
The other thing that's important is that the Crown and Parliament's policy or view is that the vast majority of colonists are loyal to the crown and it's just a few rabble-rousers. And that view is going to dominate British military policy in the Americas for the entirety of the war.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about that. And that goes to, Zach and I, Bill and I did the What's What of the American Revolution. And we talked about how there are basically two theaters, the Northern Theater and then the Southern Theater. And you're right. The first few years of the Revolution, the military strategy is dominated by the idea that if you can just cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, cut the head off the snake, you'd be okay. But that really wasn't the case. And the British found that out the hard way when they moved south. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to think about how these battles of Lexington and Concord were an enormous failure for the British for two major reasons. Number one, they contributed to the fighting that they were supposed to prevent. And number two, did not accomplish the objectives of the mission itself. Colonial leaders worked quickly. They gathered sworn statements and testimony from over 100 participants and witnesses and sent them to London to be printed in the newspaper. And they actually got there before Gage's official report of the events, which were vague at best. In the end, General Gage got most of the blame for this event. John Adams traveled from his home in Braintree, Massachusetts the next day, April 20th, and walked amongst the dead and said, quote, "The die was cast, the Rubicon crossed." And this is something that Bill and I have referenced in the past, and that is referencing Julius Caesar leading his men across the Rubicon River, basically saying that toothpaste is out of the tube, no turning back now. George Washington, to a friend, wrote, quote, "The once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched in blood or inhabited by slaves. Sad alternative. But can a virtuous man hesitate in his choice?" The last little fun fact I have for you is that there were a group of hunters who were camping in present-day Kentucky who heard news of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and they named the area in which they were camping Lexington, and it still today is known as Lexington, Kentucky. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Next week, it will just be me getting back to regular old lectures. And we're going to be talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill and the conflict that really jump-started the American Revolution. And it will be no turning back after the Battle of Bunker Hill. And the colonial leaders will make that very clear in the Second Continental Congress. Please check us out on Facebook at A Teacher of History, on Twitter at A Teacher of Hist. Check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/A Teacher of History. We would really appreciate your support. And if you could leave a rating or review on iTunes, we would also appreciate that. See you next week.
You have no idea. I've been stewing for the last half hour because I knew I said Wordsworth.